get started?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, hello everybody. I'm Alex Wang. I'm a professor here and affiliated with I'm faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute of Climate Change. Today we're really fortunate to have Joanna Lewis here with us from Georgetown. Joanna Lewis is one of the people who has really worked for such a long time on these issues of Chinese energy, clean energy development, U.S.-China cooperation, Chinese cooperation on climate-related policy with different countries around the world. She has a long history dating back now more than 20 years. First working on projects on the ground on energy with groups like Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and then for many years she's now been in academia, very prolific writing about sort of Chinese climate policy, Chinese clean energy. She has a great book on China's wind energy development, and her current book is Cooperating for the Climate, Learning from International Partnerships in China's Clean Energy Sector. It's on sale out front at a very good price, much cheaper than I bought it for. I realized I didn't get a very good deal when I bought it. And so pick one up. And so what we're going to do is Joanna's going to talk about her book and go a little bit beyond the book as well, because she's involved in a lot of different areas related to this topic. Talk for 25-30 minutes, and then we'll sit up here and just have a little bit of a discussion, and then open the floor to questions from all of you. So thanks for coming, and let's give Joanna a round of applause.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's always great to be out in California and kind of talk about these issues. It's, in Washington, this is a very tense time for talking about relations with China. So anyway, I'm very interested after I present to hear your perspectives on all this, and because it's I think very different on this coast from where I'm located. I like to come out here to get a bit of optimism. So I'm going to start talking about my new book, Cooperating for the Climate. This is sort of a project that has been in the works for 10 years or so. I started thinking about this topic when I was really working on U.S.-China cooperation and was sort of trying to understand in my role like what were other countries doing with China as well. So the framing questions of the book are, first, how have countries been cooperating with China on clean energy and climate change for the past 3 decades or so? And then how do they manage the risks and the benefits of such collaboration? I get asked all the time, why is it in the U.S. interest to collaborate with China? Or what is China getting out of this? Or what is everyone getting out of this? And so I was trying to really kind of unpack this in a systematic way. And then, of course, we have this long history of cooperating with China. We've been working with China on energy technology since the signing of the U.S.-China Science and Technology Agreement in 1979, and most countries sort of signed a similar agreement around that time period, countries in Europe and elsewhere. And so, I really wanted to kind of take stock of what we've learned over these several decades of cooperation to think about how this can inform decisions about bilateral cooperation today. I think a couple of the key contributions of the book, first of all, I did this by putting together a big data set on this. We don't actually have, we didn't have a database of bilateral cooperation with China on climate change and clean energy. The China Ministry of Foreign Affairs sort of tracks this to some extent, but the data is not complete by any means. And so you have to kind of go to every country government's databases and websites and scrape what's happening. I had a team of research assistants working on this for many years in many languages. And also, you find that kind of, particularly in the United States context, when you have a change in administrations, websites disappear. I'll talk about, for example, the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, which used to have, thousands of information, web pages, and it's all gone now. It doesn't exist. So in many ways, I created an archive of a lot of this bilateral cooperation that didn't exist before. It's all available for free download if anybody's interested. There's a database of the actual bilateral agreements, as well as a folder of copies of the agreements themselves and related documents. and I get journalists sort of emailing me all the time, like, do you have a copy of this? So hopefully that can be helpful for anyone doing research on this topic as well. So in addition to this database I put together of bilateral engagement, which I came up with 434 distinct agreements between 43 countries in the EU with China. And then I also look at 3 case studies in depth that were all kind of 3 different clean energy research centers that different countries set up with China, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then the way that I analyze this is I propose a kind of integrated framework for thinking about the political, economic, and technical factors and the trade-offs between all those that explain the rationale for and the structure of cooperation mechanisms, right? Sort of different countries come at this with different aims, whether they're political, diplomatic goals, whether they're, about technology and innovation. And so I try to kind of look at how we look at those trade-offs across the different agreements. Looking at, as I'll talk about, China's really the hub of clean energy technology development. I'm sure all of you know this. China has deployed more solar panels, more wind turbines, and on than any other country in the world. But they are also, leading in the manufacturing of these technologies and increasingly in the innovation in these technologies. That was not the case, a couple decades ago, but it is today because it's just really where the center of gravity is for the development of a lot of these technologies. And so when you look at the landscape for international cooperation with China in clean energy, if you kind of imagine, China's at the center and then all these other countries are engaging with China, that engagement in turn actually affects sort of innovation in these technologies, because a lot of the what we call like learning by doing innovation, innovation that actually happens by building wind farms and learning like how do you site them and how do you get the most electricity. You need to do that by deployment, and China is deploying these things at massive scale, more than any other country in the world. So it's become this like laboratory for innovation that all countries now can learn from. Whereas previously it was like Denmark was taking their information on how we build wind farms, transferring it to China, et cetera. And so I also map international cooperation with China across different technologies to understand which countries are engaging on which technologies and what this might mean for sort of the future innovation in these technologies. So I'll talk about all these things today briefly. So just to give a little bit of context of the data that I put together, this might not surprise you that, essentially if you look at bilateral clean energy and climate agreements with China cumulatively over the last 4 decades, you see, basically an exponential growth in these agreements being signed. We sign a lot of bilateral agreements with China, countries do, right? But specifically in the climate and clean energy space, as I define this, this has been an increasingly sort of salient area for cooperation, even when, in the U.S. context, for example, when we see tensions in other areas, we're doing less engagement on trade or on security. We are still able to engage on climate for the most part, with a few blips, which I'll talk about. But so you really see this has been kind of a growth area for bilateral engagement. And then in the book, I, kind of look at, I take this data and I code it sort of by technology focus as well as by mode of cooperation. And the way that I characterize this is, so, you can see here, just to, give you an idea of sort of which countries are engaging on different clean energy technology areas. For example, carbon capture, utilization and storage, or emissions reductions from fossil energy, renewables, and smart grid. And, you can see kind of which countries are the most interested in these technologies. It might be because that's where they have technological expertise. It might be because that's where they kind of see a future, and where they want to learn from China. And then you can also kind of look at the same thing, just sort of by share. And again, you see just a huge diversity across different countries in terms of what they're focusing on technologically. I look at mode of cooperation, which basically means, some engagement is focused on, for example, commercial opportunities. So, we have signed bilateral agreements with China, for example, in the United States or in Denmark, to really create commercial opportunities for our companies to sell clean energy technology or work with, in the Chinese market. So that is a focus of a lot of our agreements, but also some agreements are sort of just focused more on like diplomatic outcomes, dialogues, information sharing. So I kind of code those like that. And then the third category I call collaborative research, development, and demonstration. And these are bilateral agreements that are really about, cooperating on specific technologies. So, it can be researchers all in the lab together, jointly trying to develop, new technologies or innovate on existing technologies, or even, deploy, create demonstration projects jointly for technologies, with researchers from both countries working side by side. So these are, kind of the types of cooperation we see, and again, that varies by country. And then, finally, you see, of course, a bit of a, those were sort of aggregate numbers, but depending when you look at this, obviously politics and sort of things happening in the world will cause, shifts in bilateral cooperation to the extent that it can occur. From the U.S. context, you can just see, for example, this is just, pure number of agreements that were signed in this space on an annual basis. During the George W. Bush administration, you had kind of a, slowly increasing number of agreements being signed in this area. There actually, there has been bilateral cooperation with China on climate and energy, throughout both Republican and Democratic administrations in the United States. The Obama administration, particularly in 2009, was a record year ever for signing new bilateral clean energy agreements with China. This was a huge, political sort of agenda item for the administration to really scale up cooperation in this area. But then, of course, a big drop off during the Trump administration where they decided, not to prioritize climate change, broadly, and that affected the signing of new agreements, although there were many bilateral agreements that had been signed, for example, during the Obama administration that were able to continue during the Trump administration. So it's not that they necessarily shut down all cooperation, they just didn't sign new agreements with China. So I want to talk briefly about the 3 case studies that I look at in the book. I chose these because in many ways they're very sort of similar type of bilateral cooperation. This was, a case where 3 different countries wanted to set up a clean energy research center with China. And 3 countries approached this in different ways. So the first one I look at is the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. This was called the CERC. Some of you may have heard of this. This was really, I would say, the most ambitious bilateral cooperation program that the United States has ever done with China in the clean energy and climate change space. This was, this was signed in the early years of the Obama administration, really led out of the U.S. Department of Energy and the China Ministry of Science and Technology. It involved hundreds of researchers from both countries. It looked at multiple technology areas, from coal to electric vehicles to building efficiency, and then later energy and water and heavy-duty vehicles. Really trying to get scientists and engineers in the same room together, and looking for ways to kind of develop technologies or the policies sort of surrounding the technologies that would benefit both countries. And so the technology areas that we're focused on were decided as kind of mutually of interest, by both China and the United States. It was also a really unique, I would say, sort of a bilateral arrangement because it took the, you might think, okay, how are Chinese and U.S. scientists kind of working side by side on all these clean energy technologies that today you might think, is this even possible? We're competing with China in all these areas. There's a lot of tensions right now. But what was really unique about this CERC is they knew that intellectual property was a concern, right? How do you protect the intellectual property that you might be bringing to this sort of collaborative agreement? So you're a scientist from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and you want to work, with Chinese scientists side by side, but you want to make sure, if you're bringing your background IP into this, that it will be protected, and so actually this agreement had a huge protocol surrounding the management of intellectual property that was signed by the presidents of both countries and sort of trickled all the way down to the researcher level and proved really quite effective in protecting IP. This was also, I should say, a public-private partnership. So a lot of private sector companies were at the table as well. And so they also wanted to have these IP protections. And there were many examples I write about in the book where being involved in joint projects with China under the auspices of the CERC gave U.S. companies protections they wouldn't otherwise have to their IP, and they were actually able to kind of take disagreements that they would have with their Chinese counterparts to the various government representatives and get this sorted out in such a way that like you didn't have to go to legal proceedings, and it allowed a lot of cooperation to happen that might not have otherwise been possible. The second case I look at is called CNREC, or the China National Renewable Energy Center. This was something that was set up by the Danish government. Denmark is a really interesting player in bilateral cooperation with China on in clean energy in particular. You might think, what is this sort of tiny, relatively small country, playing a really outsized role in clean energy cooperation with China? But if you know Denmark, they've been, they're one of the few countries in the world that has been very successful at almost completely decarbonizing their energy sector. And so they have this story that they really like to tell to the rest of the world about how you can actually, get to almost zero carbon energy system. And, and so they also, of course, are big manufacturers of a lot of technologies, wind turbines specifically. So they really play a very, they have a huge diplomatic kind of apparatus surrounding clean energy cooperation with countries all over the world. China was really the first country that they focused on, and they've now taken like the model that they applied to China to particularly developing and emerging economies all over the world. So what was unique about CNREC is, so whereas like the US-China CERC was this, it was, it involved hundreds of researchers, but it was really like a virtual laboratory. It was sort of existing in multiple universities and labs, all over in both countries. Whereas CNREC was an actual kind of think tank that was embedded within the Chinese government. So the idea here was, if you want to influence Chinese government policy on clean energy and renewables, right, you put sort of smart people and you build capacity within the government itself so that these people can be pushing, forward ambitious policies. So they set up this think tank within the National Development Reform Commission, NDRC, which is the sort of main energy policy making apparatus in China. Within kind of this think tank that exists to advise the government on energy policy, and brought in Danish consultants and experts to really train sort of Chinese experts on things like energy modeling and all sorts of tools that would then influence policy decisions in the clean energy space. And then the third case that I look at in the book is the China-Brazil Center for Climate Change and Energy Technology Innovation, which is a handful. We call this the China-Brazil Center, or mouthful. This is, I think, a pretty interesting case. I chose this because it was really one of the biggest bilateral initiatives by a sort of so-called developing country, right, working with China that wasn't from Europe or the United States. Brazil plays a unique role, as some of you may know, in the clean energy space, particularly in their leadership in biofuels technology development. This has been, a really big part of Brazil's own sort of low carbon energy transition, and they made a lot of accomplishments in innovation in advanced biofuels technology. So this was a lab that was set up, or a center that was set up actually within Tsinghua University in Beijing, as well as in the counterpart sort of university in São Paulo, Brazil. And you had researchers going back and forth. You had a sort of secretariat in both countries, and you had a lot of joint projects put together on a variety of clean energy technologies, but specifically biofuels was one of the most successful. You had, for example, a project where a Chinese scientist developed a new biofuel sort of mechanism, a conversion mechanism, using a feedstock to kind of make a new biofuel that they felt like wouldn't really work in the Chinese context necessarily, but would work well in the Brazilian context. So they actually transferred that technology to Brazil, scaled it there, and then actually transferred it back to China and found some places to sort of adopt the technology. So this is, an interesting case, right, of like what we call South-South technology transfer, and there's not many of those that have been particularly successful. So anyway, in the book, I kind of look at these three cases side by side because they are, again, similar in what they're trying to achieve, but very different in the mechanisms for how they were established. And then, what kind of the aims were from the different countries, which all bring, very different kind of political relationships with China. So one of the things I do is sort of, talk about how you would assess these three cases along like the scale of technological benefits versus political benefits. This is just a kind of simplistic analytic framework, right, to kind of think about how these different circs, as they were, can kind of, have different benefits on these spectrums. I think the U.S.-China circ was, had really like high technological benefit because there was just a lot of new innovation happening. There was new IP created. There were new scientists trained. In my book, I talk about sort of specific metrics that came out of the joint work. And that it also, though, was used to leverage things like the Paris Agreement. The U.S.-China bilateral cooperation that was happening in the years leading up to 2015 when the Paris Agreement was ultimately signed, almost everyone would point to the U.S.-China bilateral clean energy cooperation and the relationships that were being built there at the government level, but then, all the way down to the research level as being really key to allowing something like the Paris Agreement to be successfully adopted. The Denmark-China circ is maybe a little more modest in terms of diplomatic benefits, a little more low profile, but really did have, a fair amount of technological benefit as well. And then finally, the China-Brazil Center, was really much more low profile, wasn't really used to leverage high-level diplomatic outcomes. And, it was a relatively niche technology, had relatively low kind of risk in terms of intellectual property and also, scalability. But it was really, kind of unique in terms of what it was able to do. So I think, I won't go into this in detail, but, in the book, I kind of talk about how you can then map the bilateral cooperative activities that are happening in the energy innovation space kind of across a, what we call like a research development, deployment, or demonstration and deployment continuum, right? This is what we think of as like a linear model of innovation, which is sort of imperfect, but it's just kind of a way of thinking about how technologies go from like the lab to the market. And you can then sort of map this across the different cooperative activities with China, right? So the circ on the top here, excuse all my boxes and arrows and colors. I really like making these sorts of diagrams. But the idea is you had some technologies that were actually developed in the United States, that's the blue, that were then demonstrated in China and then brought back to be deployed both in the United States and in China, right? And then, so that would be kind of one model. Another model, though, would be where Chinese and U.S. researchers together do R&D to develop a new technology that then goes to be demonstrated in each country respectively and ultimately deployed there. And there were kind of, concrete examples that you can pull from the activities of the circ that would fall under kind of both of these models of R&D. And then, the Brazil-China model, the case I just explained to you, right, was a Chinese biofuel technology developed in China, demonstrated in Brazil, and then brought back to ultimately be deployed in both countries. So this kind of allows you to think, we usually talk in a very abstract way about how we do cross-border innovation. And so in my book, I try to take these kind of, empirical case studies and use them to help us understand better how innovation can actually happen across borders, how we can really leverage the complementarities in each country to scale clean energy technologies more quickly. China, many people think of China as like really good at demonstrating technologies because like they can get projects built pretty quickly. And so, you see a lot of companies in the United States and Europe, they might have an invention, but they can't get it to market in their own country. They can't get someone to give them funding to kind of build that first demonstration project that you need to prove commercial viability. And so a lot of people actually do that in China, cheaper, to build these projects there. And there's also a lot of government funding available to do these sorts of projects. So, these are just ways to kind of think about if we have a relatively limited amount of time from a climate change perspective to, if we want to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, whatever you pick, we need to be scaling these technologies much more rapidly than we are. And so we need to think about how we do this in kind of the most efficient way globally. As we might talk about later, a lot of policy right now, what we call kind of green industrial policy, is actually working against this, is looking at how we localize, nationalize technology and sort of stop cooperating and stop moving across borders because of concerns about supply chains and decoupling and all that. So, I see that as, potentially problematic if you're trying to scale as quickly as possible from a climate perspective, but of course, comes with real national security concerns. And so, the other thing I do in the book, as I mentioned, is sort of map how different countries are engaging on a variety of different technology areas. And this just gives us an idea. This is showing, the black dots have a strong focus and the lighter would have less of a focus, like who's doing what and why, right? So, which countries are most interested in which technologies. Again, if you think of China as like the hub of where a lot of these things are happening, who's engaging where and what are their interests in doing so. The key findings I would say of this book are, I find that, of course, one of the reasons I focus on China is that it has been the primary target of international clean energy cooperation over the past few decades. More agreements have been signed with China than any other country because China is really the hub of what's happening in most of these technology markets. But of course, this is beginning to shift with rising political and economic tensions, where a lot of countries are now kind of pulling back from their bilateral engagement with China in the climate and energy space and looking to engage with other countries. We find that bilateral cooperation takes place along a continuum of political and technological benefit, and this really varies by country in terms of some countries really wanting to leverage engagement for, diplomatic outcomes, others wanting to do it more for technological benefit, and you can sort of look at how different countries manage these relationships. I find that there is less cooperation happening in certain clean energy technology areas that are key for the low carbon transition driven by competitiveness concerns. So, you do see some technology areas that are more sensitive than others. The CERC, for example, the U.S.-China Center I talked about, did nothing on renewables. They focused on efficiency, they focused on advanced coal technologies, but they, even 10 years ago, felt like this was still too tense an area in terms of having sort of direct market competition between China and the United States, solar being a great example of this, and so this was not an area for cooperation intentionally. And then, another thing I really try to do in the book is to show that we actually can measure tangible outcomes from some cooperation efforts, particularly those that have multi-year investment. A lot of times you sign an agreement and then you wonder, like, whatever comes of this. It's like, does this ever lead to anything? And if it's a one-off and there's like one meeting and then nothing happens, probably not, right? But if it's something like the CERC, which went on for over 10 years, I guess, in its entirety, and had, 10 years of pretty sustained investment from both countries contributing, you can actually measure, what that achieved in terms of, everything from like papers produced to students trained to, to patents that were generated, et cetera, and so on and so on. And actually like new technologies that were developed as well. And then finally, I think one of the big takeaways in this book is that, we really have seen this transition in how we think about bilateral cooperation with China over the last few decades, where originally, if you think back to the engagement we were doing in the 80s and 90s and even, early 2000s, it was about helping China, telling them how to do this. We are the experts in the United States, California in particular, right? Like, here's how you can be like us. That has totally flipped because we are now in a world where, the technology and the know-how is no longer just flowing to China, but also from China to us. This is important because I think not only does this change the dynamic, it makes it, now a lot harder to do this kind of cooperation because you have this real shift now in what we kind of call like global power politics, right? Like China has become the S&T leader that it has wanted to be and has been very frank about its desires, and this now makes it much harder for us to kind of engage in a lot of these areas because it's not just us sort of building capacity there, it's competing head on, right, in a lot of areas. So I'll end with maybe just a few thoughts. Again, from where I sit in Washington, so aim, primarily at federal policymakers. I think that we should think of clean energy cooperation as really a crucial component of the global climate response. And, I try to point to areas where it has actually led to important changes in China's domestic climate and energy policy. So, there really are sort of positive outcomes of engaging with China. Not that we're telling China what to do, but, having China be part of a lot of this bilateral engagement does kind of push the needle and allows for more ambitious action than you might see otherwise. And I think even in the current political and, situation that we're in now and with, various economic and security tensions, I think cooperation is indeed still possible. And in fact, still in our national interest if we design it in a way that optimizes political and technological benefit. And so I try to point to ways, again, from the lessons we've learned over past cooperation about how we can still do this, kind of even in the era that we live in today. And in fact, we shouldn't dismiss the risks, right? We actually need to identify what are the risks to engaging, particularly in the science and technology space. If they exist, how do we address them head on, right? We shouldn't ignore them. We shouldn't pretend they're not there. But we should, think about how we leverage the complementarities between each of our countries and do so in a way that manages any risks, including IP risks or anything related. And, we now know how to design mechanisms for shifting geopolitical environments. And, we have experience over the last 4 decades, with relations with China. They're up, they're down, right? They're constantly evolving. And so we've been able to kind of work through that. And I think we can do a better job of actually designing mechanisms to adapt to these sort of shifting geopolitical environments. So I will stop there and look forward to chatting.
Here, chair for you. All right, so I have a few questions for Joanna, and then start thinking about what you'd like to ask. One thing I want to note before we start our discussion is that in some ways this is the first of 4 events over the next 2 weeks that are actually pretty interrelated, right? So today we're talking about Chinese clean energy, China's cooperation with the rest of the world. Next week we have 3 different events that are relevant. On Monday we have our own Jim Salzman and David Edelman from Texas talking about kind of issues of how do you permit and get clean energy developed more quickly, right? So this challenge of environmental law in the past has been about stopping bad things. How do we accelerate the good things while avoiding the bad problem, bad environmental side effects? And this is very much part of this, how do we compete with China's dominance on clean energy in some sense. On Thursday, we have Eduardo Bitran, who's a former Minister of Public Works from Chile. He'll be here for our symposium on Friday, but doing a special session on Chile's role in global supply chains, talking about lithium in Chile. How are they thinking about engaging with China and the US and Europe and so on and so forth. And then on Friday, we have our big annual symposium on critical minerals, where we'll talk about what are critical minerals, what role do they play in the clean energy transition, who are the players, how do we think of environmental justice implications of critical mineral supply chains. So stay tuned for that. Hope you all will come out for all of these different events. So thanks so much for the presentation, and the book is terrific. One thing I wanted to actually start with is just to ask you how you think about how China got to where it is on clean energy. So stepping away, I'll ask you some questions about cooperation in a moment, but I note in the book that you sort of extend the timeline a little bit earlier than some people do. Some people focus on the transition maybe around Hu Jintao, early 2000s, as the scientific development push in China. And you've actually added some important contextualization to say, look, there were elements of this even earlier that people might not know about. So I think a lot of people here won't know the history of this. How did they get to this position of dominance in clean energy? What were the drivers of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a historian, but I sort of, look at these things mostly just having experienced them. I started as a student, right, studying all this in the 90s, and it was a really different situation. I went to China for the first time around the year 2000 and was trying to figure out what I was going to do my PhD on, and would speak to Chinese officials and say, well, I'm really interested in renewables. I think you guys should, maybe this would be a great opportunity for China. and they would laugh in my face and say, oh, we're never going to do renewables in China. These are, wind and solar. These are expensive technologies reserved for, wealthy European countries. Like we're never going to take this seriously. And we now know, of course, like that has, really a different world that we're in today. So it was sort of interesting to see this evolution, and you talk about kind of the early years of this. I mean, it used to be like I would travel all around the country to try to find like a single wind turbine. But what was fascinating is you would find that single wind turbine, and it had probably come from a Danish company or an American company, and there would be all these sort of engineers from all over the world, side by side, like from China, from Denmark, from California, Germany, like all together trying to assess like what was going on, what is the potential for wind power development in China, how could we do more, and so it was just interesting to kind of see the gears starting to turn. I think a lot of the clean energy development that was successful in China, it wasn't actually a top-down kind of process. We think a lot in China, the government snaps its fingers and things happen. It's a centralized, right, one-party state. But actually with renewables and wind in particular, I talk about wind because wind came before solar. It sort of preceded it by a decade or so. You had a lot of these like local entrepreneurs in Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, that kind of found these areas where there would potentially be great wind resources, and then brought the technology and the know-how there, built it up with like local government support, and then the national government kind of caught wind of it, no pun intended, and started to put in place very strategic subsidies. I think what China did well over the last few decades that like now we're trying to do in the United States today is have a kind of strategic roadmap for science and technology development in these technologies. And, they would sort of say, if you can read, documents from 20 years ago that say, like, we want to develop batteries. We know they are crucial for electric vehicles, for energy storage. So we want to, become the world leaders in lithium-ion batteries, et cetera, et cetera. And, like, they said this 20 years ago, and then they put the money behind it, and they develop, huge research laboratories, just focused on these technologies, and they have state support. And then, now we're in a situation where we, have the Inflation Reduction Act, and we're sort of using it as a way to use state support to catch up with China, right, or compete directly. So, I think like they had a lot of foresight. You can definitely point to like problematic tools that were used in terms of what we would call like anti-dumping and other like illegal sort of depending how you look at it, measures that were protectionist and problematic, but they were always strategic and always transparent about what their aims were, and I think that it was this kind of 3-decade or so concerted effort to really identify what are the key technologies, how we're going to support them, that has led to them being where they are today.
Great. And how do you think about the balance of renewables and coal, for example? Right, the coal presence of coal in the Chinese energy mix is still a huge issue. It's still controversial from the outside. People who don't follow it closely still cite that often as the number one reason why China is not a climate leader and this sort of thing. So how are you thinking about that these days, given your research?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, China is building more solar and more wind than any country in the world. They're also building more coal plants than any country in the world. They have more, but they're also building more new coal plants, which is terrifying from a climate perspective because these plants are going to lock in carbon for 50 years. The good news is they're building these coal plants and they're not actually running them. Makes absolutely no economic sense for the most part, but again, it has to just do with kind of this non-market economy signals. You have a lot of energy security concerns in the wake of some local blackouts, in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war, and coal is just kind of a tried and true way that China can build huge baseload power with domestic resources and avoid kind of energy security concerns. Wind and solar are also domestic resources and also can be good for energy security, but because of the way China's grid is structured, they still have problems with integrating huge amounts of renewables. So I think they're in the situation where they would like to shift away from coal. They're still building the plants. I think the hope is, even though it makes very little economic sense, and wind and solar is it's usually cheaper in most contexts now than building a coal or even natural gas plant. that they will, eventually get to the point where they can do less and less coal, and even if the plants kind of get shut down before their useful lifetime. And there actually are plants that are already being repurposed, like for other things. I think the key is storage. Right now you can't build a solar project in China without building storage as well. Like that's now mandated. It goes with the project. That didn't used to be the case. So you had all these projects kind of built not necessarily strategically all over the country, and then like it would take a while for the transmission to keep up, or things like that. They're being much more strategic now about kind of how you do that, and I see that as like hopefully we will get to a point where they will be able to move away from coal. Some people think that could be in the next year. China does have a target to peak emissions by 2030. It's 2024. Like you can't peak emissions unless you peak coal. So it has to happen in the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Now, on cooperation, were you, given all your research, were you more, did you end up thinking that these things are more effective or less effective than you had originally thought when you started the research?
Just like bilateral activities in
Yeah,
general, yeah. I mean, it's a huge mix, right?
You end up being more optimistic about this kind of thing, or less optimistic?
It's a good question. I mean, I came at this, I'm now like a student of cooperation, right? Trying to understand how cooperation works, but I came at this from being a person who was cooperating, right? Like I was working, my first job in this area was working in the China Energy Group at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, where our job was to like do all these cooperative projects with China. A lot of them were the DOE bilateral agreements that were signed in the 90s and 2000s, and I got to kind of see firsthand like what worked, what didn't work, and often it would be, particularly if you're trying to like impose something on a country they don't want to do, surprise, surprise, it probably won't work, whereas like if you sit down at a table and mutually decide like, here's what we should do together, it tends to work better, right? These are kind of basic things, but again, like I only had this like anecdotal evidence, and so wanted to look at it in a more systematic way because I felt like we hadn't really done that before. And because I knew a lot of people in the space, it like allowed me to take a more, kind of analytic look at what was happening. And so I think it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, I found a lot of examples of things that didn't work well. Right. So the answer is, it's really a question of like, so trying to figure out why. And, yeah.
What do you think is the biggest success out of, like, is it the case studies that you've highlighted, or are there other things that you thought were the biggest?
With the U.S. or in general?
No, just in cooperation in general, trying to, things that really.
It's a good question. I mean, I think, the case studies I chose, of the 3 case studies, I would say the CERC, the U.S.-China case, I mean, it really is the most ambitious thing any country has really ever done bilaterally with China in the climate and energy space. There were other countries that tried to do things of that scale. I think, for example, the UK had a very ambitious project I write about in the book to build CCS plants with China, so, putting carbon capture on huge coal plants, and they had a joint project that was like, I forget what it was called, like the net zero, or I can't remember exactly, project, and all the like millions of dollars of funding, and they were going to build these projects together with China, and it just never happened. Like they were never able to get these projects to move forward. They brought in the whole EU, it still didn't happen. And so I think the CERC was successful in that it was truly bilateral, in that, you really had the US and China at the table. So you had the presidents, then you had the ministers, then you had all the researchers, and everyone was kind of in alignment in putting together what the projects would be. So, it was set at the high level, but then every cycle, the researchers would literally get together and say, like, what should we work on? What do you want to work on? What do you want to work on? And like, you would decide on this work plan in a truly joint way. It was truly jointly funded, which is, I think, another like key thing. A lot of countries who cooperate with China, not the United States, they use foreign aid money to support what they do in Denmark and others. The United States stopped using foreign aid money to support work in China many years ago, and so all like things like the CERC, China was paying its side and the U.S. was paying its side, and I think that dynamic is actually very successful, right? Because not only is it a better political dynamic like for Congress, but it actually means that they have buy-in, right? Like if you're putting money into the game, skin in the game, as it were, like you have a much more vested interest in the outcome, right? As opposed to like someone's writing you a check and asking you to do something that you don't really want to do. Yeah.
So where do you see this kind of cooperation going in the future? Right, like China is advertising a lot of their South-South cooperation.
Yeah.
We've been all talking about the potential for maybe the U.S. and China to get involved in kind of working together with global South countries or developing countries. Where do you see this headed?
I mean, I think the real shift, as I said at the end of my talk, is, you know, it isn't now just about like how do we help China decarbonize. I mean, China still has a long way to go, and there is, I think, still space to do good work there. But now China is, you know, engaging in its own bilateral activities with a lot of the emerging and developing world. And what that looks like is, I think, really important, right? And so some of this is like South-South climate cooperation. What does that mean? You know, is it they're kind of taking solar panel, like overcapacity in solar panels and dumping them in other countries? Or is it, you know, building big hydropower projects with a lot of environmental impacts? Or is it, you know, something more constructive? And we find like a huge range of activities, of course, in terms of what China's doing overseas and in terms of energy investments, you know, kind of on all ends of the spectrum of kind of, you know, not to put a value judgment, but like positive, negative, right, from a climate perspective. So I think like China has just far more resources to engage in a lot of the countries where most of the new energy capacity is going to be built in the next few decades, right? And so I think the future of this is like, what is China going to do there, and how can the U.S. government or others influence that or complement that, leverage that investment so that it kind of goes towards the most constructive, effective, you know, types of projects, which means low carbon, but also building capacity in these countries so that they can actually kind of do these projects in a viable way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me open up to the floor, and Joanna said that she's willing to also take questions beyond just the scope of the book, because she writes in all areas on China, clean energy, and so on and so forth. So go ahead. Please just tell us who you are and
Yes, I'm a neighbor here interested in clean energy. I have two questions. First of all, Germany. I didn't hear much about Germany in your presentation.
Yep.
If I'm not mistaken, they're top leader in this clean energy. I wonder how much they relied on China in any cooperation. Spain. And number two is, I saw in one of your charts that the commercial enterprises is less than 20% on the average. Is that still the case with at the end of, in addition to research and all that stuff that you had highlighted in colors? But I think the commercial stuff is less than 20%. I was wondering why you saw it so low.
Yeah, great questions. I mean, so I didn't talk about Germany today, but in the book I do, and in the database you can see a lot of bilateral agreements signed between China and Germany. You're right, they're very active in this space. And GIZ, the German development arm, had a huge office in China that works in a lot of renewable energy related projects in particular. I don't highlight them because, you know, mostly they just didn't do a CERC type like model, a Clean Energy Research Center, which is sort of what I look at for the case study approach. But I look a lot at the kind of the broader bilateral work that they're doing. Most European countries have several, you know, if not, you know, 100, depending on, you know, maybe tens of bilateral agreements during that time period. Germany, Italy, Spain, a few I heard mentioned, UK as many, right? And so there's definitely a lot of other countries involved.
And they manufacture mostly in China as well, right?
Some technologies are and some aren't, yeah. Germany was one of the countries that had a bunch of leading solar companies that went out of business kind of as China was able to scale that technology. So it's one of the countries where there's been a lot more kind of tensions in that space. Your question about the commercial, so that I was trying to show, right, like the focus of government to government bilateral cooperation, how much had a commercial focus versus a research or diplomatic focus, right? So what I don't really look at sort of in the umbrella of this book is just pure commercial cooperation, right? That's not government facilitated in some way, just because that's kind of a different thing. In my first book, I look, completely at sort of a universe of private sector entities that are transferring technology to China in the wind space, for example. And so the reason I don't look at it kind of separately is because, as you know, like there's just state influence has such an important role in China. Like you can't be a U.S. company that just goes to China if you don't kind of have the blessing of the Chinese government in what you do. So I look at this kind of federal, national level bilateral cooperation as a way of facilitating all the private cooperation that happens. There's of course, California has a ton of subnational cooperation. I don't look at agreements signed, between states or towns or cities just because like your end becomes so huge. And most of it is kind of driven by what's happening at the high level, right? It kind of allows things to happen. If you have a really bad relationship between the two countries, it makes it very hard for private companies to do what they want to do. So that's the rationale.
And it's worth pointing, right, because you're not, the scope of your book is
I'm not looking at like every
covering-
MOU signed between
right.
every country, every
Right.
government, right? It would be thousands and thousands, yeah.
I should note that Mary Nichols is here, who's, I'm sorry to highlight you, but is one of the chairs of the California-China Climate Institute, which is doing a lot of California and China cooperation. So, yeah. So other questions? Yeah. So want to go here, the Emmett, and then
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation and discussion. I work in the climate investment space for 7 years, focus on carbon capture. But I was very curious, so I know a bit the commercial space, but the political space has always been a bubble to me. And I really like the fact that you scratched on the why some agreements are more successful than others, even though this was not the main focus. And you're mentioning joint investments. Did you find other trends that stood out to you that made some agreements more successful than others that maybe other countries could benefit from?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many, a lot of it is kind of contextual, right? Because I'm looking across many different countries, all of which bring these sort of different political contexts in the relationship, right? I mean, the Brazil case was an interesting one because when this Clean Energy Research Center was set up, relations between China and Brazil were great. That was during when President Lula was there the first time, and like climate was really big on the agenda, and they were really trying to push engagement in the space. But then, the political winds kind of shifted in Brazil, and China, was sort of less interested in engaging there. They had a lot of economic challenges. There wasn't a lot of funding to support this. They tried to kind of move Brazil out of this and turn it into a broader Latin American sort of center, and then it's kind of come back recently. So, you have these kind of broader economic and political headwinds that affect everything that happens below, right? And sets up the investment context for private actors as well. The other thing I would say, just, particularly in the clean tech space and, what we've seen shift is, it's much harder now, right, for a lot of European and American companies to set up manufacturing in China, if you're not directly transferring technology and sort of fully indigenizing it, because, originally we saw you were allowed to have like a wholly owned, entity in China building US wind turbines or whatever. That sort of won't fly today, and it wouldn't surprise you because that's actually what we're doing in the United States now with the IRA. Like we want U.S. ownership and U.S. jobs and all this. China is now like doing that, started doing that a decade before us or so. So it's a different, for foreign companies that want to succeed in the space, they have to be willing to have these local partners and find ways to make them politically viable, and kind of what that acceptability level is constantly changing in the Chinese context.
Yeah, my name is Emmett Barnes. I'm a trail here. You spoke about lessons that we've learned in terms of making bilateral agreements more resilient to shifts in the economic and geopolitical landscape. I'm curious, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what some of those lessons have been, and then sort of looking at the context of today with economic and political tensions between the U.S. and China, what any agreements might look like, and whether the prospect of another Trump presidency factors into that at all.
Okay. We'll leave the Trump thing on the side
Sure.
for a minute, answer the first two questions.
Yeah.
So, so as you may or may not know, I mean, right now, we're basically doing no science and technology cooperation with China. And in fact, I mentioned the 1979 S&T agreement, which was really this kind of high-level framework agreement that said, like, we should talk to each other about science and technology issues, right? It didn't say, like, we're gonna hand you our technology or anything. But even that agreement, which I thought was relatively non-controversial, like, it was up for renewal last year, and there was a lot of, discussion in Washington. Biden did like a 6-month extension, there's a lot of discussion about we need to renegotiate this agreement to protect US interests, which, okay, but like there, it was a very like light agreement. There wasn't a lot in there. I think what we could bring into something like that, based on what we've learned from past cooperation is, again, to just be really transparent about how we're going to manage risk. So if we're worried about IP theft, or you're the lawyers, right? So I talked to a lot of lawyers, right, in writing this book, and worked with a lot of IP lawyers and training scientists to think about what really are the risks to bilateral technology cooperation. How do you protect that? I think like we could do much more of learning from like what we did in the CERC. So we signed agreements that protected IP before we did anything collaboratively. Right now, our the kind of U.S. position is like we're not going to do anything because it's all too risky. Alex and I actually wrote a paper last year or so that said, okay, yes, some things are risky, some things aren't. Like let's actually like figure out what we're talking about here. It's not that all clean energy is risky. Let's look, supply chain by supply chain, component by component. Where is it to our U.S. advantage, like to be integrated with China? Where is it too risky? Where are there dual use, concerns? Where are there cyber concerns? Where are there economic competition concerns? And we know this now. We've done a lot of the homework to tease this out. So I think we should be designing agreements that are in our interest that have protections in place, whether it's something like the technology management plan that the CERC used. And then that allows us to engage in a way where we're sort of putting these risks front and center and addressing them. I think kind of just saying no cooperation is all too risky, it's to our detriment because China is so advanced in a lot of these areas. We are setting our companies back when we say Ford can't work with cattle, on EV technology or whatever the issue is. If they're the number one company in the world and have far more advanced technology than we do, why wouldn't we want our companies to learn if we can protect, the IP and everything around it?
So, JP, and then we'll go.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm JP. I work here at the Emmett Institute. And I'm curious, this is some sort of a speculative question, but you see that almost every country in the world uses Chinese technology for renewable EVs, etc., except for the US. So, or in a much less percentage. So do you think that if it were possible to use more Chinese technologies here in the US, would that have a positive impact in renewable generation or EVs?
So we do use Chinese technology in the U.S. It depends where you're talking about. I think what we're trying to do now in the U.S. is to use less and to have more kind of U.S. generated technologies. I think it's going to be easier to do that in some areas than others. And so I think we just need to be strategic about where we really are going to reshore supply chains or friendshore is the other, kind of importing not from China but from our allies, like countries we feel better about working with than China. I think the real crux of like what you're getting at is that, right now China manufactures, it's like the vast majority of the solar supply chain is made in China, somewhere 90%. I did a paper where we looked at like every clean energy supply chain component where China had a 50% or greater market share. It's several wind components, most of the battery supply chain, most of the solar supply chain, and then you can go to the critical mineral, depending how far upstream you go, it's a lot of the raw materials as well. So I think the issue is, what are we trying to achieve? Like, are we trying to deploy the most clean energy technology as quickly and cheaply as possible, which is what we need to achieve global climate goals? Or do we want to, you know, avoid like security risks and right? And of course the answer is, well, hopefully both, but how do we manage that? Like, how do we optimize and protect the security concerns without completely ruining our ability to deploy clean energy technologies at the scale and time we need to, you know, allow us to get on a carbon neutral pathway by mid-century, right? I mean, it's just the numbers of what you need to scale are massive, and you cannot do it without China playing a role in the supply chain. If you try to shift, I have a paper where we try to look at like, okay, so we stop buying the stuff from China, where can we put it? Like which countries even have the ability to scale up their manufacturing in solar and batteries, and how quickly could they do it? And, you know, and it's really difficult to come to a scenario where like we can reach our climate goals if China's not part of the supply chains in a pretty big way.
And, you know, there's been press, for example, on the BYD's $11,000 EV. Right, so imagine no tariffs on that, but introducing that car, how that would transform things. But there's obviously political considerations around that. So yeah, please.
Well, yes, I thank you for your book and your presentation. It's very impressive. I'm Paul Webben. I'm a former air quality regulator in California, and I've also, since that time, helped found a company in Iceland that formed a major joint venture with the Chinese company Geely. You may have heard of
Yeah.
it. I wonder if you have any anecdotes about Geely in your book, and if you've addressed kind of the next battery and solar technology, which is electrolyzer production, because that's really going to be the key to the next several decades.
Yeah, no, thank you. Great question. I mean, I'm looking primarily retrospectively in the book as opposed to, you know, looking forward. So the short answer is no. But I do think that I sort of end the book by trying to look at this, like what we've set up now, right? Like if China's kind of at the epicenter of clean energy manufacturing and deployment, and then you have all these other countries, right, trying to leverage these partnerships, where does that sort of tell us about where we're going in terms of these next generation technologies in batteries and wind and solar, right? Because China has the ability to decide where we go. As you know, like from the solar example, you know, it wasn't necessarily that polycrystalline solar was like the best technology, but it's the one they chose to massively scale and drop costs by 90%, right? Could have been thin film, it could have been, you know, and then in wind, you actually had China invest big on permanent magnet direct drive generators, which is not what GE and like the US sort of predecessors out of California used. I think primarily because of the patent, like, so GE had a lot of patents, right, that came from Zond and a lot of like the early California companies that basically made it very hard for others to move into that space because they could use those patents in a, you know, kind of protectionist way. Whereas there was only one big German company doing the permanent magnet generators. China had the magnets, they had the mines, right? And so they kind of decided to go that route. And so it's just an example of like, and now all the big offshore turbines use that technology because China kind of went that direction. So right, like we don't always choose the best technology or the most efficient. We choose like, it's whatever the market kind of drives, right? And so China has such a sizable role, they can actually shift the market, right, to one technology.
I think you might find it quite instructive to just learn a little bit about what's happened vis-a-vis Carbon Recycling International in China, where we built the world's first CO2 refinery, essentially. We're converting CO2 and renewable power connected to geothermal and other things.
Yeah, please send me some info. I'm happy to look at it.
And then when Geely came in joined the board of CRI, and we then formed a JV and established the world's largest CO2 refinery in China, which scaled it up by literally a scale of about 100. Now, Geely is at the stage of taking over the electrolyzer market and redefining it by, they've just announced a project that will call for 200 gigawatts of electrolysis. Now, the largest announced before that was in Saudi Arabia, the NEOM 2 gigawatts, which will exceed the current world's capacity of electrolyzer. Why I'm making a point of this is 6 years ago, we tried to buy an electrolyzer firm in China because when we bought our technology for the Iceland plant, that single purchase at that time was the world's largest single purchase of an electrolyzer, 6 megawatts. And we figured why make their capital with their profit as a classic example, and we want to acquire that company. We offered that company 5 times book, and the Chinese government would not allow that as a strategic investment. So my point is that when I look at the IRA's or the IRS recent announcements on the 45V tax credit, that's going to actually disincentivize the United States, and it's going to benefit Chinese electrolyzer manufacturers because it'll reward low coefficient of performance, low efficiency electrolyzers, but they'll gain a huge advantage because they can beat everybody on cost, on K-Tex. So I think because electrolyzers are so crucial to the next phase, the batteries, that's left behind. Solar technology, that's left behind. But we are really at a stage globally where who controls the electrolyzers and their production is really going to define where e-fuels will thrive. And right now, China, that single project of Geely will displace 20% of their oil imports. And that K-Tex are talking about is twice the scale of the Three Gorges Dam. So I just suggest to you that there's a lot to unwind there, but
I believe you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a huge object lesson in China.
Yeah, other questions? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I have good news. Texas produced 80% of their Sunday's electricity from renewable. And at one point, it was 100%. We're here. Why isn't California here? You know, if Texas is there, and California, because PG&E owned Newsom, and they and California Edison burned and killed people because they wouldn't put these power lines underground and taking away your solar credits.
So is the question?
Yeah, I said,
yeah.
why
Yeah.
are we so behind in California? We are. If Texas can produce 80% and 100%, why aren't we doing it?
It's all relative from where you sit, right? I mean, I sit in Washington, and California is so far ahead of everything east of,
Yeah.
So it's all relative, and of course, I mean, there's a lot of challenges you all are facing with the impacts of climate change, which I think is really driving this home in a way that we don't see on the East Coast yet. You know, there was one day last summer where we had wildfire smoke coming down from Canada, and I mean, people were just like flabbergasted, like, what is this? You know, and this is in the day-to-day life of like many parts of the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So we have a question here. Yeah.
Thank you for speaking today. I just want to ask you, what was the review from the UN reports?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
The IPCC reports?
Yes,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
will you be contributing to next year's edition as well?
Oh, great. Alex just asked me that as well. No, I did it once. I participated in the 5th assessment report of the IPCC we called, so this was not the most recent one, the one before that. So the way it works, I mean, it's a volunteer position. You spend, years of your life writing these assessments that I don't know if anyone reads them, but I think it's a really valuable process. So I learned a lot just from participating in the process. The IPCC, for those of you who don't know, it's basically you take scientists from all over the world, you try to do a massive literature review of the state of our understanding of climate change, right? We're not producing new research, but you're trying to then distill it down for policymakers to make smart decisions based on the science and the research. And so we're not diplomats, right? But you find yourself sitting around a table, like I was partnered up with a gentleman from Cuba to write, a section of our chapter, and you're kind of deciding, you're trying to be as comprehensive as possible, but with the kind of the lens of different countries coming at this from different perspectives and trying to bring in kind of all perspectives and literatures and information. So it was a fascinating experience, and it helps with my teaching and my own perspectives, but I don't plan to do it, but you never know, maybe another time.
Well, why don't we give another round of applause? Thank you so much.
all.